Rowan, thank you for joining me today. I would love for you to start out with a quick intro of who you are and what you do.
Thanks for having me. My name is Rowan Reynolds, and I'm currently General Counsel of Writer.
Okay, so before we dive into all of the complexities around AI, I'm going to do a little bit of background on you. People who are drawn to the law, from what I have observed, often have a deep seated belief in fairness and order and principles. And looking back at your life before you decided, I'm going to be a lawyer, I'm going to be an attorney, what's the first time you remember being like, okay, this is principles are important to me? Principles are what helps to solve complex human problems.
So, I it's a great question. I Let me start out with I'm a man of routine. I like routines in my life. I like order. I like logic. And the reason I say that is, I back in college, I realized pretty quickly that I liked writing. I liked papers and getting grades on papers versus taking tests. And the reason for that is I took a course. It was Intro to Ethics by this guy named Shelley Kagan. Um, he's a philosopher, and my undergraduate degree was in philosophy. And I submitted my first paper, and I think I got an F. Now I think I took the course pass fail, which was great advice. But I liked I liked constructing arguments, and I liked breaking things down in a way that made sense, not just for me, but also for whoever was reading. And clearly I didn't, let's say I missed the mark on the latter point pretty heavily for the first time around. But the reason I share that is I, I very quickly oriented around, kind of the structure of how I could make my writing resonate and present something that was clear, cogent, and in some cases concise, depending on how long I needed to write. But at the end of the day, it was something that I could control, and I really enjoyed that process. And it's a creative process. Yes, it's bounded by, okay, what are you trying to articulate? What are your sources? How are you trying to pull everything together? But I thought that was a really fun way for me to express both what I was thinking and in my creativity. I think lawyers get a bad rap for not being creative. I think we are, but we just express it in different ways. But that was the sort of first moment where I thought, okay, I think I have a skill set here. It was not, I wish I could give you a story about, I read To Kill a Mockingbird, or I saw this movie and I was like, this is my calling. It was not that. It was more of, I respect the logic and the ability to sort of form arguments, and that nudged me down the path that I'm currently on today.
Do you remember what that paper was about that you had to write?
I wish. I think I've probably forgotten it intentionally just because of how poorly I did on it. But I unfortunately I don't remember what it was about specifically.
Was there ever a moment where you're like, okay, I'm pretty good at this when it comes to this type of argument uh, or essay style writing?
Yeah, I mean, I always enjoyed writing. Uh, it was another level of trying to present my thoughts in a way that into an audience I'd never really done before. As I fast forward a little bit, I did moot court in law school, which is kind of an extension of, okay, you've got to write this brief or this argument, this appellate argument, which is an argument that you would make to an appellate court in the U.S. and you argue on your feet. You write something down, but then you have to take questions live and react quickly and be on your toes. And you want to say something, but a judge can ask you something completely different to try to shake you up or move you off of position or whatever the case may be. I never did debate, so I think my skills are
Yeah.
probably a bit less polished on that front. But the origins were I just really enjoyed the process of sitting down, thinking about what I wanted to say, and then iterating on that in a way where I could present something that was not overly technical, but something that I could stand behind and feel like, was a good articulation of what I was feeling versus, going back to the test taking point. It's like you've got an hour and you got to answer these questions. And it's not that I don't mind the pressure or enjoy that experience. I enjoyed the process more of paper writing than I did, taking an exam, so to speak.
So there's often the, especially nowadays, uh, the dilemma between legality and ethics, or what is right and what is legal. Is there a story from your time, either coming up as a lawyer or practicing, where you had to confront that?
So it's an interesting question. And the question of kind of what is legal or what is right or what is wrong. I was never a trial lawyer. So I think the experience I'll share was when I was early in career, when I was learning how to negotiate. I was learning what, different contractual terms mean. And I was working for a very large company. I was working for Accenture. And I quickly learned it's not about what's right or wrong, because that's very subjective. It's more about what was right at that particular moment for the team I was supporting, what was right based on my counterparty, so the customer or the client we were working with to finalize a deal, based on the information I had and based on what I thought we could deliver. So it's, in some sense, it's somewhat squishy, but I think what it revealed to me was I very much enjoy playing in the gray when there is not a clear answer. So I think like this concept of, binary, what is right, what is wrong in the world that I've occupied, it's much less certain and much more blurry. And as a result, like, you actually have a lot of room to play around, versus,
Mm-hmm.
in a different context where maybe those 2 points are a bit more easy to break apart into, okay, I firmly believe this is the right answer and you're wrong and here's why. It was never really like that in my career. And I think when you first come out, you get playbooks, you get positions, and then you try to articulate those, and then quickly you get counter arguments or counter positions, and people are, you realize, well, wait a second, I've kind of run out of fallbacks here because the arguments I'm hearing are pretty good. How do I work around that? What can I say? What am I not, what do I have to escalate? And really it
Mm-hmm.
becomes an exercise in active listening, in thinking and paying attention to what's going on outside of the four corners of an agreement. What's the timing? What are the needs? And it becomes this multi-variable exercise, which is grounded in, okay, yes, there are positions we obviously have to land on, which are common, but how do you get there in a way where, everybody is not necessarily happy, because that's not the sign of good result, but everybody is comfortable moving forward. And it was
Mm-hmm.
that sort of art which was not readily apparent to me coming out,
Yeah.
because those lines are not always clear.
Yeah, it does. I mean, there's kind of this assumption that obviously the binary of right and wrong can't really happen in negotiations. Nobody's right, nobody's wrong. Everybody is trying to find a common point.
So,
Um,
one of my first clients was this individual who was running um, effectively a digital storage locker business. So think of it as kind of like a G drive, but for anything, right? You could
okay.
store documents. Now, the reality is a lot of people were using this to store pirated music, pirated
Mm-hmm.
movies, but that wasn't the only use. And, you know, my role initially was, okay, let's look at some of the copyright concerns here. There's this case from the 80s called Betamax, which is a very famous Supreme Court case, which basically produced this idea of substantial non-infringing use, meaning like there could be bad uses for something, but there could also be uses which are perfectly fine. And I was born in the 80s, so I wasn't there really. I wasn't sentient when that was going on. But from what I've been able to tell, a lot of people were freaked out by the concept of a VCR, right? Movie
Mm-hmm.
studios were like, "Is this going to destroy my business?" Ultimately, it obviously didn't. But you know, I thought that was a really interesting sort of concept. But my role actually wasn't. It never got to that point because this person, they had their home raided, which was an extreme overstep as far as we were concerned. And so, to your point and question about like what is right and what is wrong, that felt objectively wrong and a huge overreach. And unfortunately, I never got to kind of explore some of the more interesting, nuanced points of law because at the end of the day, you forget, well, that's great as a lawyer sitting wherever you're sitting, people actually are affected. Their lives are affected by some of these things. And so it was more along the lines of, okay, how's this person doing? Are there extradition treaties in effect between these two countries? What can we do to kind of fight back and to make arguments to actually just put this person at ease and make sure that their rights are protected? So in that case, it was a mixture of, wow, really interesting legal point, but let's not forget that in that particular scenario earlier in my career, you had an individual's life that was actually severely impacted by what was going on. So that also was an important lesson for me to not forget, which is, you cannot forget about the human being involved,
Yeah.
regardless of whatever you're doing.
Just to clarify with the story, without getting into too many details, was the person you were representing, was it the company that was the platform that was the storage?
That's right. That's right. So
Okay.
this
So
person was
this,
actually pursued individually as a result of what their company was doing. So it
interesting.
was pretty crazy. I mean, there were some criminal components to the copyright angle, which I wasn't necessarily as familiar with then, but it was a very very much of an eye opening experience for me to just learn, both how the world works and
Mm-hmm.
how important it is not to lose sight of the fact that people are always involved here, and that's a really important variable that can often get missed.
Yeah, and that actually brings me to like this idea of when you're in unknown territory, especially in technology. And there are people involved on both sides, right? There are people who are doing the overreach of, oh, well, the law says this, and supposedly it says this, but we don't really know if it's right, but we're going to just do the overreach just to cover our rear ends. And then there's also the people who were like, well, I didn't know, or maybe I knew, but I didn't think it would extend to this level. And now we're in this moment where AI is bringing up lots of questions. Um, is there a moment where you've like fully grasped, okay, this is unprecedented, there is no established law, or maybe there is, but there's no like defining precedent for this when it comes to AI?
Yeah. So another good question. I think I'll start with just clarifying that let's take the U.S. There are plenty of laws on the books already. For example, like the FTC has Section 5 enforcement powers. So that's effectively the ability to protect consumers like you and me when a business is harming them or misleading them in a way that maybe a consumer wouldn't have expected. So there's a pre-existing toolkit out there, regardless of whatever you've seen over the past few years with regulation in AI, specifically coming out of Europe or APAC, or not at the federal level in the United States, but certainly at the state level. So there's a lot of tools that regulators already have. I think the challenge is the novelty of this particular most recent expression of AI, because as everyone knows, AI is not new. It's been around for a very long time in various forms. It was just this moment in 2022 where, when GPT came out, people got it. They were like, wow, I can use something and it can give me information back. And how neat is that? I mean, I remember the first time I used it, I asked it to give me write my 2023, risk and governance strategy based on X, Y, and Z prompts. It was fine. It was generic, but I was like, wow, that was pretty good. That gave me something to work off of. So at that moment, personally, I was like, okay, this is interesting. And there was also another colleague of mine in a prior role several months before that who was talking about, I'm hearing all these people talk about AI and it's coming and we need to do more about it. And I was like, okay, first of all, I deeply respect this person. But I kind of just took that, pinned it to the back of my head because I had, things to do. But I think those were two initial moments where, the seeds were planted. And I think, when I first joined Writer, when I went to our first AI Leaders Forum and actually saw some live demos, that's when I was like, okay, I'm both very excited and also kind of gobsmacked with, some of the work I think I need to do to make sure, we're presenting this in a way that makes sense to people, that people can control and understand. And we can get into some of the principles a little bit later. But those were three moments that stick out over the past probably 3 years or so when I saw that, the game had changed. But just to reiterate, regulation is always catching up. It's never going to be on par with something like this. That's always been the case with technology for the most part. But I think it was so novel and different and scary, and insert whatever adjective you want to insert, that it created this version of excitement and then FOMO and then regulation and then where's my return and how do I use it, so on and so forth. And it just continued to accelerate.
So your job is to help us mitigate risk here at Writer, or part of your job. And I'm actually interested in you're talking about your experience at AI Leaders Forum. What was it was there a particular capability or that was not just Writer, but just generative AI in general or AI in general that was stuck out as like, oh, that's going to be risky. How do we problem solve for that?
Yeah. So the first, it's both, risk mitigation is clearly in the purview of people in my type of role, but it's also problem solving. That's another thing that I think gets a bit lost. And a lot of the times, I'm part of a business, so I'm a business stakeholder. I always try to help people solve problems that are in front of them and not just say, well, the law says this or whatever. That's not helpful. If outside counsel wants to do that, that's fine. My job is to actually get people to a solution that they can understand and operationalize. So it's not just, risk mitigation is part of that, but it's also just being helpful and being a problem solver, not a problem creator. And I think, there wasn't a particular moment during that demo. I think it was the first time where I saw an LLM and a software platform interact in a way that was just wildly different from anything I'd ever seen. I was more used to, I think, what a lot of the market was used to at that time, which was, a chat bot or, like a chat exchange, tell me about X, or I have a question about Y. And then the, response would get produced. So it was more along the lines of that. And then what I was thinking about, my reaction in terms of both excitement and maybe some trepidation was along the lines of, and again, I think we'll talk about principles at some point during this conversation, which was, okay, how do we make sure that people are not put off or scared by the power of this? How does it get harnessed productively? And again, part of my role now, I pay attention generally to kind of what's going on in the consumer market, but I'm always looking through the sort of enterprise lens of things. How do businesses use this? How do they get comfortable? because businesses generally are going to be super risk averse. They're going to be hesitant to adopt. I think that was not the case for a little bit, to the FOMO reference, because everyone was like, what, how do I use this? How do I don't really fully understand this, but everybody's doing it. So let's get on board. It was more along the lines of, okay, how can I make sure that the people who are experiencing this for the first time, who are super risk averse, can get comfortable with what the technology is, how it can help them, what controls they have in place, how they understand it, how they utilize it, how it can, actually improve a user's lives or improve the customers of our customers' lives, things like that. And that was just all kind of meta level thoughts in the moment. They're like distinct steps that I've taken since then. But it was more along the lines of, how do I solve for future problems that I know this is going to create? Basically, because the version or the form of this is so novel and new that I knew it was going to be very scary to people.
What are the can of worms? Like, there are several cans of worms that AI opens, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit first. So, can you talk me through what those cans of worms are?
So many. Oh my goodness. So many. So look, I think the first and most obvious one is you have this very, well, somewhat opaque global regulatory structure right now. So which is not, it's not new, because we saw this with privacy in 2018 with GDPR. And for those that aren't familiar, it's kind of the foundational
Anti-spam
privacy
and
law
yeah.
that came out of Europe in 2018 that sort of harmonized a lot of principles that were already in existence. And that created this global framework that I think California is a great example of a US state that quickly adopted many of the same principles. And then it's kind of happened across other states in the US. But the point being, you've got European standards. You don't have any general U.S. framework. You have state by state frameworks. You have other countries dipping their toes in the pool, so to speak. You have principles that aren't enshrined in regulation that people have pointed to, and all of this makes for, okay, what am I supposed to do? What's my roadmap? I mean, the easiest thing to do is, if you get a question from a regulator, which is not a great place to be, but it happens, you can respond to that. That's pretty clear. But in between that point, how do you operate in a world where you seem to have not so much harmony? I think at a high level there is, but when you have many
The
different
patchwork.
frameworks,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, it's just it's hard. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, who's responsible for what, right? Like, you have companies and inventors and developers that are building this technology. You have people that are in companies that are using this technology, both for their own benefit and for the benefit of others downstream. Who's responsible if something goes wrong? And it's a really interesting and difficult question. And I think the boring answer is, well, you allocate risk and responsibility in the contract. Okay, that's fine. That's one thing. But the reality is, let's just talk about the ecosystem, irrespective of whatever agreements people have in place. Like, if you have ever seen Planet Earth or listened to David Attenborough, which is just an amazing show, you realize that ecosystems have shared, like, everybody has a role to play in it in order to make the ecosystem work. And I think the same is true here. So you have the people that are building the technology. You can't just say, okay, I'm going to build whatever I need to build, and then you, as the consumer of my technology or the user of it, anything you do with it, that's on you. That doesn't seem right to me. It also doesn't seem right for a user to kind of just do whatever they feel like doing and saying, well, you know, you gave me the technology and I happen to use it for something I wasn't supposed to. Uh, it's your fault. So it's not a binary thing. And
I'm going to
yeah,
sidetrack you for a second
yeah.
because this sounds like a lot like what people are still arguing about over social media platforms, right? About when you've got a place like X or Facebook and you've got people spreading misinformation, for example, who's to blame? The content moderators, right? Should there be content moderators? Is the platform to blame? Are the people who originate the misinformation to blame? So that's obviously being explored to this day. And
Mm-hmm.
now we've got this whole other conundrum when it comes to AI, because now we've got, uh, obviously these platforms that are models delivering outputs, and you've got users who are taking who are ideating those outputs, telling the models to generate them, and then possibly putting them into play.
Mm-hmm.
Or you next step, because some of these platforms, including Writer, are getting agentic actions going where they can actually interact with the world outside of that platform. So I'm just putting that into more concrete terms. But do you, I mean, is that the parallel you're seeing
Yeah,
too?
I think that's right. And, there's another podcast here for someone who's much more familiar with CDA Section 230, which is what you're indirectly referring to. This is the debate, right? Can you
Mm-hmm.
hold an X liable for something that gets posted by a user? Really hard question. I think there's a lot of scrutiny on that law, which I think was passed in the 90s, but it's actually provided, content platforms, and actually, encourage the growth of the conversation online. You can't control everything that gets said, and there's toxicity out there. There's also really good debate out there,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a question that I don't think has a very clean answer. And I think if you draw the parallel to AI and back to the ecosystem point, it is a shared responsibility. It's a shared responsibility in that, number one, the developer of a technology or a platform, needs to educate to a certain extent, but it also needs to provide sort of the toolkit for people, to understand how to use. And then at the end of the day, or on the other side, the people who are using, they also need to communicate, hey, like, I don't, I don't have sufficient understanding about how this works, or how this output was generated. I don't understand it. It's not transparent enough for me. Can you help me get there? And the answer is not always going to be clear, but the point is, um, it is a mutually shared objective to make this whole grand experiment work. And I think putting the onus on one versus the other exclusively doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think the AI Act actually does a decent job at trying to assign roles and responsibilities.
And
But I
this is
think,
from the
again, like,
EU. Are you
pardon?
talking about the AI Act from the EU
That's
or?
right. That's right. That's
Okay.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but life and how people use things in life is a whole lot messier than what anybody can write down on a piece of paper in a contract, in a law. And this sort of almost continuous loop of feedback, um, to me, is I mean, it's not the thing that's going to solve all the problems, but it just opens up the dialogue to try to move things forward in a way where at least you're not just pointing fingers. You're saying, look, we're all in this boat together for this grand experiment. The world has already moved to an AI centric place. It's just going to continue to happen whether we like it or not. So knowing that, let's try to work together and figure out a way where at least people are going to be uh, comfortable to a certain extent. They understand what control they have, what control they don't have, and then the people that are actually building this stuff, um, understand and can take that feedback into account to just push the ball forward productively versus saying, well, okay, I've done what I need to do. It's on you. I just don't think that works.
Yeah. And that also, brings us to the discussion about principles, right? About saying, let's agree to a certain set of principles around which we can build
Yeah.
a framework. So talk me through some of the principles that what you think would be a good starting point.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many out there. I mean, I've already touched on a couple of them. I mean, let's just talk about transparency and explainability, right? Like it's just, and so, all of these I will say, but in particular, those two are grounded in this concept of trust, and that people need to trust what they're working with in order to use it. And how do you get to trust? You get to trust by understanding how certain outputs were generated, right? Is there sort of reasoning you can follow? Where did it pull this information from? And explainability, because if you're going to if you understand how something was produced based on prompts you wrote or inputs you've put in, and you're relying on that not just to get an answer, but as part of an overall process, whether it's just you know part of an agentic flow or just something more simple, you really have to understand every single step to be able to rely on it, whether you're just a consumer or whether you're a business and super risk averse. And I think that leads into this concept of human-centric AI. So AI is wonderful. I do not think we are at the point where AGI is real. I'm not a technologist. That's just my own personal belief. At the end of the day, I firmly believe that AI humans that adopt AI will responsibly, versus just kind of wholly relying on AI to do their job or to do a process. That's not going to work. There needs to be some sort of interaction involved where someone can either double check or just validate. And the reason that's important is, this is a bit of an anecdote, that's somewhat, I would say, probably unrelated, but just bear with me, and we're going to riff for a little bit here.
Bear with you. I love anecdotes, man.
So like imagine I am, I'm creating some sort of like legal AI use case. Now, when I talk to outside counsel, I talk to them not just because I need, their insight on a, on a particular subject matter of expertise that they possess and I do not possess, but it's also, they have many clients, and some of their clients might be trying to solve similar problems, and those clients might be in similar or exact or maybe different situations, and their risk thresholds might be different, their businesses might be in different stages, their needs might be different. At some point, will an LLM be able to perhaps kind of go through that analysis? Maybe. It feels very like plugged into a matrix type thing to me, which seems very far off. But the point is, like, I need that person's both expertise, judgment, and insight and feel based on what I'm describing to help me make an informed decision. And that human interaction is why it's so important to have AI be human centric and not just kind of rely on the process and not have anybody be involved. So that's why I think that's super important. And I think the last piece is is safety and security, right? Like data these days is it's everywhere. And so some people might argue that in the advent of social media, personal privacy is somewhat dead because you have these trade-offs that don't really exist. It's kind of like, do you give away all your personal privacy norms to be on a social media platform? Kind of feels that way sometimes. I know that's not necessarily always the case, but with AI, it's because you have to give it contextual data to help you make it work for whatever you need to work. So in some cases, it's data that's regulated. In some cases, it's data that's ordinary business confidential information that's very important to a company or to an individual. In some cases, it's just maybe, data that doesn't matter. But I gotta trust the system I'm putting this stuff in, that it's not going, that it's going to protect it, that it's going to keep it safe and secure. And again, this all kind of ladders back into the trust point. But to me, it's those three principles. So transparency, explainability, human centricity, and safety and security. And there are many, many more. But to me, those are the three that really stick out as being the most, some of the most critical.
And this is, I mean, we're pointing to a conversation about the white paper that we're going to be releasing tomorrow, actually. But those are the core parts of the framework that we're building. To extend the agentic aspect of this is another set of complications, I think. Because then again, you've got this, all right, so we can securely understand a model's outputs, but then you've got the agent who's taking whatever instructions the model has recommended and doing its thing either out on the web or in, through these MCP connectors. And so but it comes back down to these principles, right? I mean, the principles are extended regardless of what the technology capabilities are. Is that where you're coming from? Are there any other considerations that we should be thinking about?
I mean, look, I mentioned those three principles not just because of the, whatever's getting released tomorrow. I actually truly believe them, and it's,
Mm-hmm.
there are different ways to talk about them, but it's always been true for me when I've worked in technology and for software companies.
Mm-hmm.
People need to trust what they're using. Obviously it needs to work, right? There needs to be some sort of return on their investment. It needs to work, but at the end of the day, like they've got to trust that how the software or platform has been designed is
Mm-hmm.
gonna line up with their expectations. And I think I touched on this a little bit before about the FOMO point, but it's like you had the most easily understandable and a mass market point of view iteration of AI that people glommed onto and could get. And then there was a fear of missing out thing where people just was, oh, well, let's do this. And then there was a retraction. Well, okay, that's not really good enough for me from a enterprise point of view, not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
from a consumer point of view. And then there was an emphasis on ROI and usability and reliability. Is this working? Is this, is the juice worth the squeeze? And then we're in agentic. People just got their head around, again, this is my own point of view,
Mm-hmm.
what generative AI was. And now you have to explain the fact that you have, multiple agents speaking with each other and speaking with an LLM and speaking with a piece of software and speaking with third party, sources at the same time. That is a lot. And so you can get and it's also no different than generally how software works. Like software can be as complicated or as simple as you would like. And I think like we often don't have a lot of visibility on, unless you work for a company, on really like complicated, novel, unique implementations of software that make things work really well. And I think we will see how that plays out with, the agentic world. But it is, if you don't get the core foundational components right, whether you want to call it control or observability or transparency and understanding what's going on, it's just going to break because you've added so much technical complexity on top of that with
Mm-hmm.
using some of the examples that I just mentioned, that it can feel very much out of control. But at the same time, on the flip side, if you do get those things right and you build something in a way where you're able to tackle what seemed like a very manual process or a complicated process, it can be truly an eye-opening experience to see how it works. And I've seen, everybody sees, marketing materials, but like when I see real demos,
Mm-hmm.
and Writer is an example because like I just have visibility into Writer because I work there, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
see demos. I don't see demos from other companies, but I'm like, damn, that's amazing. That's truly amazing. And I could not do that. Like I personally could not build that. But when I see how that works and see how different agents speak to each other that solve a complex business problem, it's pretty eye-opening. But you got to get the foundation right.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that was a question that keeps coming up is like, well, who's accountable if an agent goes rogue, right? Is it the model developer? Is it the whoever prompted the agent to begin with? And that's a whole puzzle for you and professionals like you to work out, Rowan.
Yeah. I mean, look, software has and always will be buggy. It's the same. It's in configurable and customizable. It's the same thing here. It's just you've added a novel type of technology that people are still trying to get their hands around.
Mm-hmm.
Coming out of kind of the cloud era where people finally, they got, okay, now I know what like cloud hosting means versus hosting everything on-prem. That was
Mm-hmm.
a shift. And then people got around that and they were like, oh, okay, I just have to log into my software from browser and then it works. And how amazing is that? Without really kind of
Mm-hmm.
understanding what was going on in the back end. It's the same thing here.
Yeah. No,
And yeah,
there is a one people perceive it as a bug, but it's not a feature, and that's LLM hallucination. Which I mean, from what I understand, hallucinations are part of the way that models work. I mean, it's how their algorithms work, and that brings the requirement of human in the loop to the stage, right? That human centric AI to begin with. Um, is there a concrete example of a time you've had to kind of say, no, this, we need to have a human in the loop, uh, basically a policy of it, or,
yeah,
you know,
you know what, you hear about hallucination a lot and you hear about human in the loop a lot, but you don't often see them defined. Yes, okay,
mm-hmm,
a hallucination is, you have a prompt and the output is not the answer you were looking for, or it's incorrect, it's false.
yeah,
Okay, fine. But like hallucinations, you know there's a wide spectrum of what they can look like, and it's not always like the answer is wrong. It just may not be like the form of the answer you wanted, or the
mm-hmm,
structure or the content is a little bit off. Like that's also a hallucination, right? And in other
mm-hmm.
words, it's
Because
it's
it's
not
probabilistic, it's not
it
deterministic,
it's not what I was looking for. It's not like
right?
the sort of non-technical answer is, well, that's not working for me. That was not what I
Mm-hmm,
was expecting. But to answer your question, we built a NDA review assistant, and
mm-hmm,
we had a lot of help building it. I wrote a lot of the prompts, kind of grokking off of what I've learned from our friends over in the CS and SA teams at Writer. And one thing I still haven't gotten completely right is mutuality. So in an NDA, it's supposed to be sort of a handshake. Hey, we're going to share information with each other. No obligation to move forward with whatever we're talking about, but we're going to protect that information. There are so many different ways that mutuality can be expressed in a document. It's not like this NDA is mutual. Okay, great. That's easy enough to sort of prompt for. But you can say it differently. There can be, you know, there can be party names at the top, and then it defines the two as both parties, and then then the parties will agree. That didn't get captured in some of my initial prompting, and I've had to make 3, 4, 5 adjustments. It still isn't perfect. It's pretty good. But the point is, we still step in and look at, whenever the agent, highlights a discrepancy based on the playbook that I've enshrined in prompts. We still look in and say, okay, that's fine. So it's saved a bunch of time, but is it perfect? No. And that's why human in the loop is important. And, while I still have the mic, I think legal use cases are really challenging. I think some of them work really well in AI. Like if you want to summarize, a court decision, or you want to summarize depositions, or, fine, great. I think there's a lot of utility there. But if you want to redline an MSA, okay, you can give it a playbook. But like to my point at the very beginning, what's the context? Does the deal need to close? Or is there another partnership agreement that is not part of the MSA? That's also a relationship that's being formed that should be reflective of how the parties are allocating risk. Do we care in this case about a particular term that may not matter, or an indemnity that we're willing to give or not give or ask for? The variables are almost limitless. So in that case, yes, you can kind of get a head start, and
But
get
it's just too
maybe an initial point of view.
sensitive. Yeah,
But
it's
like,
too context sensitive
like
to
the LM or
yeah.
the software problem doesn't have the context that someone who's reviewing that, who's hooked in to the business might. And
Yeah.
that's why, while I'm an advocate and I'm a believer in AI, it is as a supplement and not as a replacement. I could be wrong, and yes, like I would love to keep my career because you've heard a lot of chatter about, oh, AI is coming for legal. Okay, fine, maybe that's true. I think I have a few more years left in the tank before that happens. But that's just an example of how, taking a more human-centric approach, having a human literally in the loop, in this case, checking, does make sense. And it's not a compromise on efficiency or time, because you can still be more efficient, but it doesn't mean you sort of abdicate all of the responsibility on a probabilistic model. It just doesn't make sense to me.
We are close to needing to wrap up, but I did want to check in and see, like, you're at the very beginning stages of this, even though we've already had AI for years, and we do have some frameworks in place that we can refer to. It's still very much a frontier. And I'm curious what you would like to see in the next decade or so.
I don't want to see people be just to tag along to what I was saying. I don't want new norms to be formed where people just are wholly reliant on it. I think there's some really important and existential questions about, how AI will continue to impact the next generation of workers, the job market. I think we've already seen some of that happen. So I don't want, I don't want to see entire, groups of people lose their jobs. But at the same time, like, that will happen. But in some ways, if people understand that this is a tool that they will have to use in some respects in order to get better at their job or do their job, that's something that I wish, maybe it's easy to shine a light on just because AI is at the tip of everybody's tongue these days. But I don't want to see the mistake of just sort of outsourcing to AI and feeling like that's how the world is going to run. I don't think that makes sense to me. I think that just loses human ingenuity and creativity and inventiveness. So I hope we are not at that point in 10 or 20 years. At that point, if we are, that means AGI has taken over, and maybe we're in the Skynet land for those Terminator 2 fans out there. I hope that's not the case. So I'll probably, I hope that there is a there's a mutually beneficial coexistence that allows people to do things that were once thought to be very difficult and hard in a more productive and less manual way. And I have seen that to a certain extent, since I've been working for an AI company. But we are at such early stages of the technology and people's understanding and how to use it. So I'm a glass half full person. So I'm optimistic that things will continue to progress in a really productive way without losing the humanity that I think makes us all unique contributors to the world.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, and I loved hearing your thoughts. Thanks, Rowan.
Thanks for having me.
Deconstructing Data is the show that makes data make sense. Every Thursday, David Finkelstein and myself, Jesse Lezak, sit down with industry experts to unpack how data really drives marketing. We do this in plain language anyone can understand. If you want real insights, real conversations, and zero jargon, tune into Deconstructing Data live on LinkedIn every Thursday at 4:15 p.m. Eastern Time.